Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores human dynamics. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We talk with researchers and other interesting people to unlock the mysteries of our behavior by using behavioral science lens.
And today we're excited to welcome Dr. Emily Falk, a neuroscientist and psychologist who studies how our brains make decisions and why we value what we value.
Yeah, Emily is a professor of communication, psychology, and marketing at the University of Pennsylvania, where she directs the Communication Neuroscience Lab. Her research focuses on what makes ideas and messages persuasive and how social influences shape our behavior.
And we're going to talk to her about her new book, What We Value, which explores the fascinating neuroscience behind our decisions and how understanding our brain's value calculations can help us make better choices and connect more deeply with others.
For our listeners interested in applying behavioral science to their work, Emily's research provides a valuable set of insights into how messaging can be designed to resonate with two important systems that we discussed in our conversation. First, our self-relevant section of our brain, and then the second is the social relevant section of the brain. And both are critical in deciding what we value and how we behave.
And what I found particularly interesting, Tim, about our conversation is how Emily explains the practical applications of neuroscience concepts like value calculations and prediction errors, terms that might sound technical, but actually explain a lot of our everyday behaviors that we all experience. And more importantly, I think she offers us a way to make our decision-making better. Now, whether you're interested in behavior change, communication, relationships, or simply just understanding why we make the choices that we do. Why do we do what we do, Tim, right?
Why?
This conversation provides a valuable framework and very practical insights.
So we encourage you to sit back and relax with a value center on the rocks and enjoy our conversation with Dr. Emily Falk.
Value center on the rocks. That sounds like a horrible drink.
Emily Falk, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you here. Today, I'm so looking forward to this conversation. And we're going to start with a couple of quick speed round questions. First, super easy one, Kool-Aid or peppermint tea?
Peppermint tea, definitely.
Excellent.
I love peppermint tea.
We might come back to that.
There's a lavender peppermint tea that I'm kind of obsessed with right now. And we drink a lot of peppermint tea in this house. So definitely peppermint tea.
The lavender peppermint tea sounds really fascinating. I mean, that seems
it feels
very
like
cool.
a special treat luxury kind of situation.
I can see
As
that.
opposed to just regular peppermint tea.
Yeah, I mean, I do love a good regular peppermint tea with maybe a little honey, maybe a little honey and lemon.
Okay. Nice. All right. We're going to stick with the speed round here. Dinner with your favorite musician or your favorite athlete?
Favorite musician, for sure.
Okay.
Good.
Well, for sure.
Good answer. Love that.
Yeah, you just ingratiated yourself with Tim here. As always, who would that? Is there a person that you have on, like, you're thinking of for that dinner?
Oh man, I mean, there are so many amazing musicians. From the conversation that we were just having before, I mean, one person who comes to mind is my dad.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, it's always interesting when we ask people this question. And oftentimes they do pick musician, and as opposed to like an athlete, or sometimes we say actor or whatever it is. And it's always we just have, I think there'd be a much deeper conversation over dinner with a musician as opposed to an athlete or different pieces. Was that any of the part that came into your mind, or was it just that you like, the musical part of it?
Well, I mean, I think there's the first couple folks who came to mind for me are people who I love playing music with. Like, I have a neighbor named Sandra, who's an amazing guitar player, and I know I love having dinner with her. They're obviously famous musicians, and, who knows what it would be like to get to talk with them about that life. I do think, on the other side, I know I was quick to say, like, I would choose the musician because there are these people that I love that come to mind. But on the athlete side of things, athletes are so good at pursuing goals. I mean, I guess musicians are too. So in terms of the core things that my research is interested in. I think both, at any sort of elite level of performance, people who have a passion and then pursue that in a way that makes them excellent at it. Like, I guess I'm pretty easy. Like, I really like having dinner with people. So I can totally be convinced to be psyched about having dinner with an amazing professional athlete.
In the end, it's just about having those good conversations, and regardless of who they are, right? Okay, fantastic.
I was really heartened to hear you say your dad. That's really beautiful and sentimental. I was kind of half expecting maybe Emily Salyers from the Indigo Girls or Dar Williams. You talk about them in the book, and great songwriters.
Yeah, what if we had a dinner that was like the Indigo Girls and like Chapel Roan now, talking about like the different kinds of things that they're trying to do. That would be super fun. I would totally go to that dinner. 100%.
Host that dinner. That would be fantastic. Okay. All righty. We are quickly plowing through the speed round as we normally do. Third question, wedding ring toss or not?
Yeah, well, you've read the book. And as you know, my partner Brett proposed that during our wedding, we practice in advance and get so in sync that we could simultaneously toss our wedding rings and catch them on the fingers. And we did practice that. Like, I know what I'm answering here. Like, I know how hard it is to throw a little tiny circular wedding ring and try to catch it on your finger. And as fun as that would be, I decided that, like, in the specific situation that it would have unfolded in, that there were maybe other priorities or things that we wanted to have the focus of that moment. So I opted for not the wedding ring toss. But, now, like at dinner tonight, like, sure, I'm open to that.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
All right.
That I love that story in the book, and it was just so we needed to answer. We needed to get that answer,
and very diplomatically addressed, by the way. You get bonus points for diplomacy.
Yeah. All right. Last of our speed round questions. Was your mom right when she told you as a kid, if you don't like how you're feeling, change what you're thinking?
Was she right? Yeah. I mean, look, my mom's right about a lot of things, right? And now, as a parent myself, I can say, I really hope that, in 30 years or whatever, when my kids are on the equivalent of behavioral groups, having a super fun conversation, that all of the amazing things that I've passed down from them, maybe including, if you want to change the way you're feeling, change the way you're thinking, that will make sense and resonate. But for sure, I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm hoping that folks will take away from the book is that there are so many possibilities when we understand how our brains work and how we understand the processes that are unfolding in our own minds, that we have a lot of possibilities that we can pursue, including about how we feel about different situations by focusing on different elements of the situation or different goals that we might have. So yeah, in terms of, was my mom right? I would say so.
How wonderful is that? Okay, we are talking with Emily about her new book, What We Value. And let's start with some basic understandings. When you're talking about value, you're a psychologist and neuroscientist. And let's get a baseline for what you mean by value. What do we value? What are the values that you're referring to? Are we talking about moral codes or what?
Yeah. So when neuroscientists talk about value, what I mean here is a calculation that's unfolding in our brains for each conscious decision that we decide to make. And we take inputs from all different brain systems, including emotional processing systems, our rational deliberative thoughts, our social motivations, what we think about ourselves, what we think other people think about us. And those are all integrated into what we call a common currency, or sort of final common pathway to decision making, where we weigh different kinds of inputs. And you mentioned the possibility of moral values, which is one thing, that kind of capital V values that people might think of when they think of value or values. I think another common thing that people think about is like economic value, like how valuable is this toaster? How valuable is my wedding ring? And in that sense, those are both things that contribute to the kind of neuroscientific value calculation that I'm describing, right? So our big picture moral values that we get from our education, from our upbringing, from the culture that we're part of. those things contribute to how we weigh and think about our day-to-day decision making, especially when we pay attention and give focus to those things. When we're making choices about what to buy or what to consume, economic factors are also potentially going to play a role, but there are so many other things as well. And so in our brains, that value calculation is really trying to optimize the reward for the me that's right here, right now. Like, what is going to be most rewarding for me in this moment, unless I sort of consciously choose to try to plan for the future. So it's taking into account our past experiences, our current context, our future goals, and it's weighing them and outputting this information about what is likely to be most valuable or rewarding.
Yeah. So in the book, you call that value calculation. Is that what you're talking about, and kind of that weighing of those different pieces?
Exactly. So that value calculation is happening for many different kinds of choices that we're making. And that's happening within the brain's value system, which is a set of regions, a network of regions that make these value calculations day in and day out.
So the lavender tea, or the peppermint tea with lavender outweighs, the Earl Grey tea. And so you're, in the morning, that's what, your brain is doing those calculations in certain aspects. Is that right?
For sure.
Yeah.
And in terms of the way this value calculation works, there's sort of three parts of it, right? One is what am I choosing between?
Okay.
For me, I'm actually never going to choose the Earl Grey. That is not even part of my consideration of my choice
Just
set.
throw that.
Maybe
That's not even that's not even part of the
lavender
calculation.
Mint, maybe orange juice, maybe some Bengal spice tea. That's pretty delicious.
Yeah.
Maybe something fruity. And, so thinking about my past experience, I know Earl Grey tea doesn't really resonate with me. Don't really like the way it tastes. Also, I can't handle caffeine. I'm already amped up enough as a person. And so it's going to have bad effects if I go down that caffeine route. So first my brain is going to figure out what are the choices that I'm choosing between. Then it's going to assign some kind of subjective value weight to each of those choices, which might include things like how tasty do I think this is going to be? Which one did I have yesterday? Am I in the mood for something comforting and consistent, or something new and novel? Maybe I look at, how many tea bags are left in each of the boxes, and think about whether I feel like going to the grocery store later, right? So there are all of these different things that are going to fold into that value calculation. And then critically afterwards, I'll drink the tea, and there will be either a positive prediction error, something that says, wow, that was amazing. That was better than I thought it was. Or a negative prediction error, ooh, I thought I was in the mood for something that I've never tried before, some kind of lemon verbena or something. And actually, it's kind of gross. I don't like that. And so then my brain stores that information and uses it next time.
Thus, you know that Earl Grey is not going to be in that calculation again because of that. Yeah. All right. Emily, just real quick. So before we get into this, you do a nice job in the book of explaining how you do this research, and with fMRI. Can you, for our listeners, just do a quick overview of the type of research you're doing to study this, and then the way that an fMRI works? So.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of research about how human brains work is done using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, which measures changes in oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the brain. So as all of our cells in our body work, they require oxygen and glucose to function. And so when our brains are firing most heavily, they need sort of a resupply of those resources. And so blood will flow to the neurons that are firing most heavily in order to replace their oxygen. And so by tracking where that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood is flowing in the brain, we can get a proxy for where our brains are most active. And that's a really useful thing, because we can see, what kinds of systems are engaged during different kinds of tasks and experiences that humans do in a really non-invasive way, because our bodies already are doing this, right? So it doesn't require us to drink a disgusting radioactive tracer or, other kinds of things that other modalities might demand. So love that about fMRI. it is, hugely expensive, and it's a big piece of equipment. And so a limitation of this kind of methodology is that historically, and a lot of the research that I describe in the book has been done at major university centers that have the resources to collect this kind of data. And so it's a really small sliver of humanity that's been captured so far in this kind of research, though that's changed over time. And I think more recent work does a better job of this.
Yeah, that's cool. That's a great explanation of it. So we're not really actually looking at the synapses in our brain to see what's firing. It's about blood flow, which in some ways sounds so much simpler and more accessible.
Yeah, so we're not looking at the actual firing of, say, individual neurons, right? There are other techniques that would allow that, but they would have many other limitations that don't work for the kind of work that I want to do. And fMRI is a really nice kind of balance between spatial and temporal resolution. So we can get, millimeter level resolution, which is much bigger than a neuron, but still pretty good in terms of the geography of the brain. And we can get pretty good temporal resolution. So, we can get, let's say, measurements every second or so. So again, that's much slower than the firing of our synapses, but it is adequate for the kinds of psychological thought that I'm interested in.
All right, I want to take us back to, as we talked about the value calculations, very different things. One of the interesting pieces that you talk about in the book is messaging and how messaging can change value calculations. Can you talk a little bit about what you found from that perspective?
So just like we talked about the fact that our context matters and our recent experiences might shape our value calculations, one really ubiquitous source of influence is messaging. And messaging might include media messaging, like campaign messages from an advertising campaign or from public health officials. It might include product advertising. It might include messages that we're seeing on social media or conversations that we're having with other people. And we know that the inputs to the value calculation include lots of information about what we think other people think. So that's a very powerful thing that shapes what we value and what we think is likely to be rewarding and important. And so when we look at what happens in people's brains as they're exposed to different kinds of messaging, the more the messages tend to activate the brain's value system, as well as other brain systems that I'm really interested in that calculate whether things are relevant to us, relevant to people that we care about. The more activation we see in those core brain regions, the more likely it is that people are going to behave in message consistent ways, or that the message will be effective.
Yeah.
You bring up a couple of key pillars in the book, and that is relevance, right? So there's the self-relevance system and the social relevance system. Both are important. Human beings are absolutely reliant on our social skills and collaborating with others to survive. But can you spend just a minute in describing the importance of having both a self-relevant system and a social relevant system in the way that we value things?
Yeah, and they're also highly intertwined with each other. So when we use our self-relevance system, that helps us understand what's me and what's not me. What do I like? What are my preferences? What are my personality traits like? And our social relevance system, which I call our social relevance system, but scientists also call like the mentalizing system or theory of mind system, that helps us understand what other people think and feel. It helps us predict critically what they're going to do in the future, which then makes it easier for us to collaborate, coordinate, negotiate, compete with them in different ways. So that self-relevant system and social relevant system both overlap with regions in the brain's value system and both shape what we value through that value calculation.
You mentioned at the very beginning of that answer, you talk about the me, not me, and I thought that was a really interesting way of kind of looking at this. Can you talk a little bit about how that me, not me helps us understand the coherent story of who we are? That's kind of where it's going, and if I understood that correctly?
Yeah, so the brain self-relevant system helps us understand ourselves, and it helps us make sense of our experiences. It helps us think about who we are. So when scientists give people words like intelligent or messy or acrobatic. And if I asked you, to make judgments about whether you are those things, that would engage your brain's self-relevance system as you thought about like, am I messy? Am I intelligent? Am I polite? Am I obnoxious? And
well, Tim would answer yes on that. There you go. There, perfect. So sorry.
I wouldn't like the answers, but I could ask them.
That's actually pretty unusual. So if that's true, if Tim would say like, yeah, I can be kind of obnoxious, like to have that kind of self-awareness is actually kind of rare, I think. And part of that is that our brain's self-relevant systems and value systems are really intertwined. So there was a really beautiful study that I love from Rob Chavez and Dylan Wagner, where they trained a computer algorithm to understand whether activation in people's brains was judging something as me or not me, and whether they were judging the same kinds of pictures as being good or bad. And what they found was that these two systems are so kind of highly intertwined that when they trained the algorithm on one of those kinds of judgments, that they could do a pretty good job predicting what people were thinking on the other one. And so when we look at behaviorally what happens, I've tried to run these kinds of studies for a long time. And when Christine Schultz was a grad student in my lab, she and I decided we were going to run a study to try to like disentangle these a bit. And in order to do that, we decided we were going to come up with a bunch of words that fit into 4 different quadrants. Words that were me and good, me and bad, not me and good, not me and bad. And Christine ran probably like 6 pilot studies, I want to say, like a lot of experiments trying to come up with things that fit into all of those quadrants. And over again, we kept getting stuff on the diagonals, me and good, not me and bad. So it was rare for people to say what you're suggesting that Tim might say of like, yeah, sure, obnoxious is not like the most positive quality, but I would endorse it, right? So I'm not taking a position on whether Tim would say that or not, but I'm saying if you were to say then it would be unusual.
But I just did, and I fit on that diagonal, right? I just said, other, Tim, and obnoxious.
Bad.
And that, so it fits on that diagonal where oh my gosh, that is really fascinating. So sorry,
I think it's like it's not only fascinating, but it's really important to understand, right? Because if we have this bias going in that me is good, then the things that I've done in the past also sort of get this like, oh, that was probably, I'm not saying that like we endorse all of the things that we've ever done. Sure, like surely you've had regrets. But when we think about changing our behavior, it can elicit a lot of defensiveness, right? Because we come up with reasons why the things that we did made sense, why the things that sort of compose who we are good, because we want to have that like sense of coherent and positive self. And I think it also sort of gives some insight into ways that we can counteract that kind of bias or defensiveness, right? So one that I really love is values affirmation, where we take a step back and we think about, well, what is it that really matters to me? So my core values might include things like friendship or connection with people in my community. For me, for many folks, it might be things like their spirituality or political causes that they care about or their creativity. And when we take a minute to reflect on those things that are really important to us, that matter the most, then the kind of peripheral things, like some little thing that you're asking me to change, like maybe Brett's asking me to put down my phone and pay attention to him at dinner time, or, maybe I'm trying to convince my mom to like get some more exercise. And by taking a minute to reflect on the things that actually are core, we can see that like the particular thing that we're trying to change right now isn't what defines us. And it can give us a little bit more space to change gracefully, right? It can make us more open to that kind of change. And in the brain, we see in two studies that we've run, that when people were given the chance to reflect on those kinds of things that were most important to them first, and then given coaching messaging about getting more physically active, that even though the literal coaching messages they were receiving were the same, that people who had first had that chance to self-affirm, to reflect on their core values, showed more activation in the value and self-relevance systems than people who weren't given that opportunity, who just reflected about why other values might be important to other people, but not to me. And then the extent of that activation was also related to how much they went on to actually change their behavior in the following month.
Yeah. And you saw that across, right? When there was more activation in those, then the subsequent behavior was more likely to happen in those experiments from what I got from the book.
Right, exactly. So basically we see that like values affirmation, and not just we, many scientists have looked at the effects of values affirmation on people's willingness to change their prior beliefs or behaviors. And then what we did that was new is we looked at what happened in people's brains as they were undergoing the values affirmation, the coaching that follows. And then we followed them in these studies with basically accelerometers. Like imagine something like a Fitbit, but that doesn't give you feedback. So we objectively know how sedentary and how active they're being on different days. And Yuna Kong was a postdoc in my lab when we ran the second one of these. It was a really huge Herculean effort, and she just did a phenomenal job. But she also really pushed me to think about what was going on. Because I think I was thinking before this work that like self-relevance is really important. And we know this from lots of different kinds of evidence that when we think of behaviors as being more relevant to me, we also think of them as being more valuable in many cases. But Yuna opened my eyes to another way of thinking about change, which was that, you know, she's an expert in a lot of contemplative practices like meditation, loving kindness, other kinds of things like that. And she really convinced me that the other route, besides convincing people that things are relevant to them, is to help them let go of the bounded sense of self that most of us walk around with. To say, you know what? The picture of me that my brain fabricates is a stylized social media profile, essentially, right? It's like something that helps me make meaning and helps me function in the world, but isn't necessarily objectively like true. And when people meditate a lot, they can let go of that sense of like fixed bounded self. And then there's really nothing left to defend if you let go of these very firm boundaries of like, this is me, this is not me.
So to what degree is the message like aligning to you're better off and you have a happier life if you actually do a better job of aligning yourself with your life, with your values, with who you really are, your true self.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of those ways of thinking about things can be helpful, and sometimes one feels more accessible than the other, right? So in the book, I talk a little bit about an example where my brother was trying to convince me to run faster. My siblings are like super athletic. They run marathons. And, you know, after I go for a jog with my sister, we get to the base of my street and she's like, let's just like do some sprints up the block and like we'll get faster. And I'm like, okay. I mean, I love some me time and I like the feeling of like having exercised, but like I wasn't specifically trying to get faster. And also I think, you know, for a long time, I had the incorrect assumption that there's this dichotomy between like nerds, academics, people who are really good at school, and like jocks that, you know, and going back to the media messages thing, like some of this comes from the media that we're exposed to, these tropes in, you know, 90s movies or whatever. But my brother said to me, like, a lot of academics are really good runners. They have the skills for planning, for hard work, for following through on things, even when, you know, the gratification is far in the future. And if you just did some, you know, targeted workouts, you could get faster. And the other thing that he did was, so he linked it to my identity, an identity that's really important to me, being an academic, being somebody who can plan and delay gratification and push through things that are hard in service of bigger picture goals. So he brought in that sort of self-relevance component. And then he also added this social reward of like, if you were faster and you could keep up with me and Lily, my little sister, then you could get all the gossip. like that happens on the runs, right? Like you could be part of this like amazing social experience that's running with us.
Your brother was smart.
Yeah. Social reward, social relevance part. I mean, I'm still not nearly as fast as either of
Captain
them,
Persuasive. Wow.
Yeah, it was super effective.
And of course, you became a faster runner.
I mean, a little bit within bounds, right? I mean, but I think that's also an important thing to say is like small changes over the course of our life can add up to a really big deal, right? So I'm never going to run a marathon as fast as my brother. Like that's just maybe a thing I might taunt him about that like it could happen, but like we both know off the record that like it's not going to happen. But you know, making these little changes to work at it, like I am a little faster than I used to be. And also like finding the enjoyment in doing that. But you asked me, Tim, about like, should we lean into that, like making things self-relevant? And I think there are definitely many situations where that's a great move. I also think that reminding ourselves that self-relevance can also be a double-edged sword is important because the ways that we think about ourselves are limited by lots of different things, right? They're limited by this stylized profile that our brain creates. They're limited by social expectations of what the media and what our culture is telling us about the kind of person that's a fast runner, the kind of person that's an astronaut, or the kind of person that's a investment banker, or the kind of person that's, you know, an acrobat, right? And so when we think about those stereotypes, it can also be limiting in how we imagine the self-relevance of particular choices to be to us. And since that's really intertwined with value, it also, you know, often sensibly means like, well, maybe this isn't going to be as rewarding for me as it would be for someone for whom it would be easier. So like remembering that that self-relevance can also get us in trouble when it sort of pre-selects out opportunities that might be really fun or interesting or meaningful or lucrative or whatever else for us.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Kurt, and we want to say thanks for listening to Behavioral Grooves. And we hope that you're enjoying this episode, but it feels a little bit one-sided. You're hearing from us, but we're not hearing from you.
This is Tim, and we have two suggestions to remedy that. The first is join our Facebook page and engage with us.
We want to talk with you. We want to hear your perspectives, and hopefully our Facebook page might be the place to have some of that interaction. So please come and join us.
The other recommendation we have for you is to leave us a quick rating. You know, the little 5-star thing at the bottom of your app? Or a short review. Just leave us a few words about what you like about behavioral groups. We'd very much appreciate it.
Thanks, and we now return you to our regularly scheduled programming. You titled Chapter 5 of your book, Become the Least Offensive Person You Know. And I think that's part, and in there you talk about the endowment effect and how that can be both valuable, but also limiting. Is that kind of where you're going with this conversation here?
Exactly. And, you know, I didn't end up writing about this in the book, but actually now I'm like a little embarrassed to say this. Anyway, what I was going to say is like one of the compliments that I found like most meaningful that I've gotten in my life was one of my mothers-in-law once said to me, like, you know, I really didn't know this about you for a long time, but I think you might be the least defensive person I know. And I was like, oh, like, I'm not sure that that's true. But like, if I can engage with people that I care about in a way where it feels like that, where it feels like they're being heard and like I'm taking their perspective into consideration and like, what a win, right? Like to be able to grow from like those inputs from other people. And so that just felt like such a big deal, like such a big compliment.
And why is that important? Why is it important to be that or strive to be the least offensive person you know? What does that do for us and how does that impact our lives?
Yeah. So I think like you were just alluding to, Kurt, I think it can open us to new possibilities. It can make it available to do things that we wouldn't otherwise think of as me or that are different than what we've done before, to try new things. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is the piece I was just alluding to, which is that there are so many different ways of thinking and being in the world. And there's growing evidence that diverse teams come up with better solutions, more creative solutions, like, innovate in ways that individuals can't do on their own, or that people who are really similar to each other might have a harder time coming up with. When people are able to challenge each other in productive ways, that's also, super important for business, for research, for our ability to kind of make societal progress. But it's also really hard, right? When we're in the room with people who think differently than we think, or that have different assumptions, different life experiences coming in, like that can be so challenging. It can be challenging for a lot of reasons. Like, one is it requires more communication to understand what they mean, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. We also worry that we might mess up, right? Like that if we don't understand where somebody's coming from, it's easier. Like, I think this is legitimate fear. It's easier to offend somebody. It's easier to hurt them. It's easier to mess up our relationship, which as humans is something that we are wired to deeply, deeply care about. Yeah. And so when we can let go of some of that defensiveness, I think it opens up so many possibilities for expanding our own horizons, collaborating more effectively, solving problems in new and different ways.
Yeah. Boom. I love that. Just thank you so much. You said that so beautifully, Emily. Okay, let's stick with family for just a sec. And I want to go back to the speed round, to the comment that your mom made, to what you want to pass on to the future next 5 generations. This wonderful message about, if you don't like the way you feel, change the way you think. Explain to our listeners why that is not just so important, but how we can do it and how we can actually, what difference it makes in our lives.
Yeah. So there's a lot of research on what's called reappraisal, which is about changing the way that we feel by changing what we're thinking about or how we're thinking about a particular situation. And this kind of emotion regulation strategy can be used if we want to dial down negative emotions. So, for example, a really common way that researchers study this is they might show pictures of negative scenes, like a scary spider or a gory, bloody scene, or a picture of somebody in a hospital bed who looks like they might be suffering. And what researchers teach people to do in that kind of situation is to think about it in a different way. So for the gory scene, maybe to think this is a movie set and it's actually ketchup rather than a real, crime scene. Or for the person in the hospital bed who's crying, thinking to themselves like, oh, maybe that person is crying tears of joy because they just found out that there's a life-saving treatment rather than that they're upset about their own prognosis, right? And so that can change the person who's trying to regulate their emotions, feelings, to feel less negative. We can also do this when we get really excited about something, but it might actually be helpful for us to hit pause for a minute. So, for example, in a negotiation, like let's say you're apartment hunting and you find an apartment that's super beautiful and it has a perfect bay window and it would be walkable to the park and it's like, your dream place. But then you go to put a deposit down and you find that somebody else actually got the apartment. Or, you're negotiating about the price and you don't want to just be like, oh my God, I'll pay all my money for this, right? You might want to also put some focus on like things that would be less ideal, like it's right next to a noisy train station and kind of looks like maybe the sink was going to leak and like it's unclear if the landlord would be that responsive or, whatever. So I think, people often intuitively think about wanting to regulate or dampen their negative emotions, but this ability to flexibly tailor our emotional responses to particular situations can be really helpful. I mean, there are other situations where we might want to dial up our negative emotions, like in a moment where you want to harness your anger to make social change, right? To think about like, what are the things that we actually want to do to make the world better? Or in a study that Bruce Doré led in my lab, we looked at helping people dial up their negative emotions in response to health messaging. So a natural reaction that many people have, like I was saying, in the studies where scientists teach people to downregulate their negative emotions, is to say, well, the person in that image isn't actually suffering that much. So in the case of Bruce's study, we had these anti-binge drinking PSAs that highlight the real negative consequences that a lot of people suffer from excessive binge drinking. So things related to car crashes, things related to violence, things related to just, having a horrible hangover and puking your brains out. Like, nobody likes that, right? And so if people were naturally downregulating those negative emotions, being like, well, it's just an actor, and that's pretty unlikely to happen to me for these reasons, right? That activating that sort of defensive response, then the message itself is likely to be less convincing. And so when we had people, lean into like, think about why this could actually happen to you and like what the negative consequences might actually be, then their brain's self-relevance and value systems showed more activation, and they were more likely to endorse that the messages were relevant to them later.
Yeah. Emily, I want to talk about, or have you talk about some of the aspects of connection that you talk about in the later part of the book, and particularly about getting in sync. It's one of the aspects that you talk about a lot. Goes back to the wedding toss question from the very beginning. You were talking about, well, you're going to get in sync if we do, and you talk about your husband tossing you keys and different things as you leave the thing, and how in sync you are with all of that. But why is it, and what is it about getting in sync that is important to connection, and what has your research shown about that?
Yeah. People's brains are so amazing, right? Like, as we're having this conversation, if we have the same understanding about what's going on, there's going to be some parts of our brain that are changing their activity in the same ways. So scientists have seen this in lots of different kinds of settings. For example, when people tell a story and then other people listen to that story, if the speakers and listeners' brains are more in sync, if they're increasing and decreasing their activation in similar ways, then they have more shared understanding. So that's measured by like the listener remembers the facts of the story more accurately, for example. There's also been research looking at when people watch movies, their brains often are synchronized by engaging with that same shared stimulus. And people who are friends with each other, like close together in their social networks, show that even more than people who are strangers. So that's in line with this idea that like people that we're in sync with or click with or have, shared experience and maybe shared geography or shared history, that we tend to respond to media messages in similar ways. But I think it gets really interesting and important when we consider like what's causing that, and then also like, do we want to be in sync all the time? So before I get into that, I'll say like it feels amazing to be in sync in a lot of ways, right? Like if you've ever danced with somebody where it went well, like there's that kind of coordination that feels so great, or playing music together, right? Part of that is like being in sync literally with another person and having our brains follow the same patterns. But in the current moment, especially in this sort of polarized political moment, I think it won't shock people to know that our brains don't get in sync easily with everybody, right? So there have been a number of studies looking, for example, at when American liberal and conservative folks, people who identify with different political orientations, watch the news. So they're watching the same exact news clip. And I just told you that watching, YouTube clips or whatever brings people's brains into sync. But people who have different political ideologies, their brains often respond differently. And so I think, one possible interpretation of that is like, well, we're just doomed, polarization in the brain, like, blah, right? But I really want to resist that interpretation, because there's other research that suggests that it's not that bad. It's not that simple. And so let me just unpack for a minute
Great.
why I'm saying that. There was one study that was led by Yara Yashurin in Yuri Hassan's lab at Princeton, where they looked at what happened when people had different kinds of assumptions going into a story. So they used J.D. Salinger's story, Pretty Mouth and Green My Eyes. And in that story, there's a character named Arthur. So half of the people are randomized to be told that the main character, Arthur, is having an affair. And the other half are randomized to be told that he's not. And then in the story, a number of events unfold, and the people who are in different groups have different opinions about whether his wife, Joni, is paranoid or whether she has good reason to be concerned. And what the neuroscientists saw in scanning people's brains as they did this is that the people who had one set of assumptions going into the story, one backstory, showed similar responses to one another, but different brain responses than the people who were told the other backstory. So again, even though they're listening to the same words and sentences and paragraphs, they're making different meaning of it. So those assumptions that we have going into hearing a story shape the way that our brain responds. It's not just literally the stimulus in the moment, but that cumulative experience of other things that we're bringing to the table. And so when we think about the political situation, the kinds of media that we consume are different when we have different political views, the things that we seek out, the people that we talk to. And so then in that kind of sense, it's maybe not so surprising that when we're confronted with a new piece of news that we make different meaning of it. Some researchers did a behavioral study that I really liked, though, where they randomized people, for example, people who were typically Fox News viewers to watch CNN in the same time slot when they'd typically watch the news. And what they found in that study was that after, not that long of watching a different kind of news, that people's beliefs shifted a little bit and their policy preferences shifted a little bit. And what they thought was important shifted a little bit. And so again, like these kinds of small changes to our media diets, to the people that we engage with, to who we're willing to have a conversation with, can transform who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. Emily, just on the being in sync part, just have this might be a strange question, but the causality of the connection. You talked about friends tend to be more in sync watching those movies, various different aspects of it. Is there a causality though of being in sync, maybe lending itself to being more friends? And I asked this because I attended a Adam Grant presentation one time, and Adam had the entire group, clap together in a certain beat. And as part of that, he was saying, we've seen that there are, in work and other places, that when you're doing things together, that you then like that person better and you have better connections with that person. So is there a causality of being in sync from what you know? And I don't know, just kind of expand on your thoughts there.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to unpack from what you're bringing up here, right? So certainly doing things together can have benefits, right? So when we think about how to get people who have different identities to feel connected to each other, a common tool that psychologists use is to have people solve problems together, something where I have one part of the solution and you have another. And when we work together, afterwards we'll feel closer. That's not exactly necessarily being in sync. That might be complementing each other. And so in some work that this amazing team at Princeton and I have gotten to do recently, we've been curious about, when is it that we want to be in sync and what are the other possibilities for coordination? Shannon Burns and Lily Choi were postdocs with me and Diana Tamir during the pandemic. And they did this Herculean task of scanning not only individual people's brains, but pairs of people who came into the lab and had real conversations. At Princeton, there are 2 scanners that are next to each other. And so people could have actual real life conversations. Wow. And Lily brought friends, so pairs of people who already said, we like each other, we care about each other, we know each other well. And strangers who didn't know each other already, and had them play a game called Fast Friends. And I love Fast Friends. Just as a side note, it's so great. It's this protocol where you can randomly assign people to have a friend. And it's like, well, what's the formula for having a friend? And basically, it starts out with icebreaker kind of questions, like the speed round kind of stuff that you open the podcast with. And then it gets progressively more intimate. And what we saw in those data, in a paper that Sebastian Speer just led that just came out in Nature Communications, is that when the strangers played the game, on average, they spent a lot of the time in the scanner essentially building synchrony. Like, this goes a little beyond our data, but kind of maybe building common ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So over the course of the study, activation in their brain's social relevance systems kind of converge. The friends did something a little bit different. So what they did was they fairly quickly get in sync. So their brains are more aligned at the beginning, but then they don't stop there. They use that as kind of a jumping off point, and they explore. So their brains diverge. They take each other on these little mental adventures to do, to cover a wider range of topics. So the friends cover more varied topics. They cover topics that are farther apart from each other with a linguistic analysis. And when you look at what happens in their brains look like they're exploring too. And so this is not a causal study. You asked me about causality, Kurt, but just in terms of what your question made me think of, I think there's been so much research that has demonstrated the value of synchrony. And I love some good synchrony too. But I think we don't do ourselves a service by imagining that what we want all the time is to just be totally in sync. If we had a conversation that was completely in sync, it would be so boring. We'd just be repeating the same things back and forth to each other.
Yes, I know. Right? Yeah.
It's like Kurt and me. We're just so constantly bored and in sync.
Oh man, I do. You mentioned at the beginning of that, Emily, our brains are just so fascinating, and I could not agree with that statement more. I think it's one of the things that has drawn us into this world of talking with bright people like you and various different pieces. But yeah, anyway, I'm sorry, I'm pontificating now. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, there's so many more questions that we could ask, but I do want to get to the last chapter of the book. I Am the Beginning. You start with a Nobel Prize laureate's story, and it's pretty amazing. But just the whole concept of ending the book with "I am the beginning" was a really lovely hook for me to go, well, wait a minute. I thought we're kind of we're rounding out, getting towards the end. But you're saying "I am the beginning" is in a much bigger way, and so I wanted to just ask, tell us about what's important about that and what it should mean to us.
Yeah, thank you. So, "I am the beginning" comes from this Maria Ressa work. Let me start.
The
that
Nobel
over,
laureate.
Actually. Yeah. So basically, the idea of the last chapter of the book is that just like earlier in the book, we learn about how powerfully other people influence us, that we also influence other people. So we are those social reference for the people around us. And when other people see us making particular choices, it makes it a little bit more likely that they're going to make the same choices too. And so what that means is that if we want to shape the future, not just for ourselves, but also for other people in our communities, other people in the world around us, that kind of starts in our minds. That starts in our brains, in the choices that we're making and in who we think we are, and in making choices that then ripple out to influence other people. So in that chapter, I tell the story of Maria Ressa, who's a journalist who has made some really courageous choices in her life and ended up getting a Nobel Peace Prize for her work, which went really deep in challenging the Duterte regime. And, there are so many big choices that Maria made that I think when many of us look at them are like, oh, what an amazing human. I don't know if I could ever do that. But
like putting your life at risk stuff. Yeah. She put her life at risk. Yeah.
big, serious choices in the way that she chose to do her reporting, in the way that she chose to persevere, in the way that she chose to really challenge the status quo. And she has this incredible autobiography called How to Stand Up to a Dictator. And in that book, she really breaks down all the little things in her life, from her childhood, from her education, from the values of her cultures, her multiple cultures, that informed little choices that she made as a kid that taught her about connecting with other people. So she talks about like going to a pajama party after she had recently immigrated to the US, and she didn't know what a pajama party was. And she showed up in her pajamas because she thought that's what was supposed to happen. And she tells this really like lovely, simple story of the kid in her class not making fun of her, but just being like, cool, let's go inside. You can change. And, you know, these little tiny experiences, we were talking at the beginning of our conversation about prediction error, right? And so she felt a lot of fear in that moment, like being in the car and looking out and seeing all of the people at the party dressed in a different way. And she could have just been like, I'm out, right? But kind of just pushing through those little things taught her like, no, we can trust other people to like have our backs and to connect with them. Or, you know, in her work learning to be a musician, like she talks about some of the lessons that she learned from her music teacher about like persistence and things like that, right? And she really breaks down how all of these little choices in her life added up to being able to be this kind of example for other people. And she really consciously does that. She really consciously thinks of herself, I think, in those terms in the book. And then not only for herself, but she ended up through this company that she founded, Rappler, which is an organization that shares news. Like they were an early innovator in terms of like using cell phones and having people be able to report in everyday kinds of contexts. And they helped make campaigns that like got young people to vote. So that I Am the Beginning slogan comes from her work, you know, galvanizing many, many people to recognize that these little actions that they could take around voting, around, you know, being part of a democracy could have a big effect. And so, you know, I think there are these little things that we can do too. We can vote, we can contact our representatives, we can show up to community meetings, but also in our families, like the things that we talk about with our kids, the things that we talk about with folks at work. Those influence what people think is valuable. It influences what they think is possible for themselves or for other people. And so that I Am the Beginning really resonated with me as also being like part of why I do what I do, is to help people think about like, what is possible, not just for me, but for what we could do together.
We had a conversation with Christina Bicchieri, a colleague of yours at Penn, several years ago, where we were talking about social norms because she's a sociologist, and and I remember her being very pointed, and we were talking about social norms and how powerful they are in shaping you. And she said, and just don't forget, you're part of the social norm. What you do influences what will happen in what we consider a social norm. And so I loved that chapter because it was just very reinforcing and kind of liberating, actually. Kurt, would you mind if I ask a question about music?
I was expecting none other than you asking a question.
But it's kind of tied into relevance, self-relevance, and social relevance, because I'm just curious, like, what role does music play in the world of self-relevance and social relevance? Is there a role for it, do you think?
Wow. There's like, you weren't joking when you said we could spend the last 45 minutes of a conversation just on that.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
So what are some of the roles that music could play in terms of self-relevance and social relevance? You know, one is that music is a way that we communicate with each other, right? So many people use music as a way of expressing themselves, and then many other people see themselves in that, right? So music shapes norms about, you know, how we think about love or how we think about lots of other kinds of topics that are the focus. The kinds of preferences that we express about our music also are shaped by norms. So you alluded earlier in the book, I talk a little bit about like self-consciousness and declaring strong music preferences based on, whether other people thought that my music preferences in high school were cool or not.
Yeah.
And so, those kinds of things that we resonate with, I think, is one layer of it. Another, though, is the process itself, right? The way that playing music together and getting in sync and doing something with other people can be magical, right? So I think about like playing music with my kid. I have twins who are 9, and one of them's learning how to play the guitar and the other's learning how to play the piano. And none of the three of us is a particularly like exceptional musician. But, having that time every day where we hang out and, somebody plays the guitar or the piano and we sing together is like one of my very favorite parts of the day. It's like so special.
Wow.
To do this thing that is like really just for the joy and connection of it, right? It doesn't like serve a external utility purpose, but it helps us, be in sync, complement each other, and really just connect in a way that's really special to me.
Love that. You also wrote about how important it is that if you're going to learn a new instrument, to just start playing songs that you love to play, like play songs that you love, rather than work on your all the basics of fingering and learn how to do scales and technique and all that kind of stuff. Just play songs. And by the way, this totally syncs with the way that I've approached coaching people who are just getting started for a long time too. But why is that a good idea?
Yeah. So I'll tell you this story. Okay. So when I was a kid, my dad used to play music all the time, and it was really special just in like a similar way that I like to do that with my kids now. But after he passed away in 2019, that was something that I felt like was a huge loss. And I felt like I wanted to learn how to play the guitar so that I could have that kind of music in my house still. And there's this incredible program at Penn called Music in the Dorms. And I don't have a dorm room. I'm not a student, but I have an office. And I asked them if I could get in on this program. And so they had a teacher who was a super great guy come to my office on Tuesday mornings, and we'd play music for half an hour. But the thing is that he was like this incredible classical guitarist, and he really wanted me to learn, Bach and things that were like gonna make me a really good musician and do these etudes and like great. Like I like a challenge. And one of the things my dad had said to me when he was alive was like, you want to really like learn the fundamentals and like be able to play all up and down the neck. And he had said all of these things that like I hadn't really taken in because I wasn't trying to learn to play music because he was doing it. Anyway, so my first guitar teacher was very focused on the pushing through the challenge. And when I'd ask him about, what about the Grateful Dead, or what about like songs that made me feel connected to my dad, he'd be like, yeah, you can figure that out. But I couldn't, right? I wasn't at the point yet where I could. And so every single practice session was like slogging through. I'd make these deals with myself like, okay, if I practice for 10 minutes, then I can eat a chocolate bar or something like that, right? And when the pandemic hit and there was a reasonable excuse to hit pause, I took it and I just stopped taking guitar lessons for a while. And then fast forward to, as the pandemic was lessening its grip on us a little bit, I started looking for a new guitar teacher. And I found this guy, Gabriel, who lives in my neighborhood, and he comes over and he like really understood why I wanted to play music. Like he understood the role that it played in terms of feeling connected to my roots, to my dad, to these like really special memories from my childhood. And he would like transcribe videos or listen to like little snippets of audio I had recorded on my phone, and like really leaned into those reasons why it was important to me. And then all of a sudden practicing like didn't feel hard anymore, right? It was something that I really wanted to do. And so Tim, you're asking like, well, why might we want to start with music that is joyful or music that we really enjoy? When we think about how the brain's value system works, it really prioritizes immediate rewards over delayed, longer term things. So psychologists have called this present bias. You may have heard people talk about delayed discounting, intertemporal choice. And in many, many studies, we see that people are impatient, right? They prefer the reward that happens right now to the reward that happens later. But when people think about changing their behavior or learning a new skill, like learning how to play the guitar, sometimes we think about like, what's the thing that's going to be most efficient or best for me in the long run? So like, what's the thing that's going to stave off the cancer and heart disease, in terms of my exercise regimen? And then people end up doing things that are a grind, things that are really hard and maybe unpleasant as a result, when they'd be better served by choosing something which is both good for that long-term goal and also pleasurable, joyful, rewarding in the moment. So like with the learning the guitar example, like it's not that I'm saying like don't be precise about the fingerings that you're learning,
Right.
but choose music where like it matters and where you care whether it's right or not. So like, on the flip side of it, like I love rock and roll and like the kinds of songs that make me think about my dad. But my kid Theo, who's learning to play the guitar, loves Bach. Like he just really wants to play classical music. So it's like the flip side of it. I'm like, come on, let's sing The Monkey and the Engineer. And he's like, I will be playing Minuet in G, like with some swing for you.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I love it. Last music question, and this is just curious. If you could be in the studio for any album when it was being recorded, is there one that you would just be like, oh, this would be so fantastic?
Oh, man. I mean, I think I will go back to our earlier conversation about the Indigo Girls. Like some of that early Indigo Girls music, I really love it. And, I think their dynamic between the two of them is like so sweet. Like what
and
a
rare. Yeah.
Yeah, what a joy to think about like having a partner who is also like the person that you're doing your life's work with, and like what a delight. So
or pain, and another time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know. I'm not somebody who's like delved really deeply into the backstories and lives of famous folks, but in my fantasy, it would be like this amazing.
I could see like just like listening to like how they work through Galileo in the studio. I mean, that in just that song, I think would be fantastic to just watch the creative processes that's going through. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Emily, thank you so much for being a guest on Behavior Grooves today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun.
Welcome to our grooving session where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Emily, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our value-laced brains.
Value. It is all about values for Emily, isn't it?
I mean, it's. I think there's a lot of stuff, but I was very interested in like this value formation piece in the ways that we can think about value from how it's just framed, right? That communication piece and what that changes in our brains and the bounded self. I mean, oh my gosh, that was cool.
The social norm stuff, the I am the beginning, the social relevance versus the individual stuff. This is all really super important stuff. And I'm really glad that she also is learning how to play guitar.
Well, we gotta keep that legacy going with from her dad and different things. I think it was really interesting. We talked with her about a bunch of different things, but you talked about that social piece and I am the beginning, also the bounded self, right?
Yeah,
and I think that was an interesting part and.
Self-schema, and I mean, kind of connects to all this self-schema stuff. And,
that we've talked about in the past.
Yep.
I think the thing I'd like to really dig into, though, Tim, if you're okay with this, is
Yeah.
this idea of becoming less defensive. This be the least
No
defensive
way.
person
Stop.
in the
No.
world.
No, stop. I'm
In
not
the
going to
room,
talk
not the
about that.
world, not the world, right? It was her grandma, be the least offensive person in the room. Was that it? I think
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
right. Yes.
I mean, it's just an interesting concept, you know?
It's a concept that I instantly see these business connections with it. I mean, how often have you been in meetings with clients where they really don't want to hear you tell them the
Oh,
truth?
yeah. Well, and it's interesting because you get factions, right? In some of those business meetings. And the people that bring you in are one faction, and if I'm from the consultancy side, right? And then
Yes.
there's others who is this outside guy and why is he telling us
Yeah.
things that are, he doesn't understand us, and you get that defensiveness. And so there's some interesting science around defensiveness. And so there's some stuff from the British Journal of Social Psychology that has shown how defensiveness is this response to wrongdoing. Defensiveness in response to wrongdoing. In other words, perceived wrongdoing that you have,
Yeah.
that you've been
Yeah.
wronged, is kind of made worse by making the wrongdoer feel like they're outcasts. So, like, the response is like, you outcast, which is, again, when you're just talking about this, right? This idea, oh, I come in and I'm not necessarily a wrongdoer, but I'm bringing up some inconvenient truths, or maybe
Hmm.
pointing out some things that are bad, which feels like I'm doing them harm, right?
Yeah.
And this idea, and then what happens?
Defensiveness.
Yeah, and you get pushed out, you get outcast, and
Yeah.
so
I did a project with with an international seed company a bunch of years ago where we used we wanted to lower the defensiveness in order to be persuasive among a group
okay,
of farmers who are pretty conservative people, pretty value based people, absolutely value based, business people, and but the problem was that there were these resistant herbicide resistant weeds that were coming into the upper Midwest,
okay.
and so there was sort of a trajectory that they're coming from the South through the general part of the Midwest. They're on their way to the upper Midwest, and if the farmers didn't get on board and start taking action now, their farms would be consumed by these herbicide resistant weeds.
Okay.
So instead of bringing a bunch of experts in and having lectures, to
Here is the weed Micus corniganus, kill us all of your plantus.
I love your ability to just jump into the Latin there. Well done. um, but so what we did was we brought farmers from areas from a very localized area into like school cafeterias and had groups of like 10 of them, and these were all adjacent farms, like they all knew each
Mm-hmm.
other, and sat them down and then divided them into two groups and had the first group. They were tasked with trying to define what they wanted the legacy of their farm to be, like what was the
Ah,
future of their farm, sort of define this. Where do I want the farm to be in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, 100 years? And then the other group was tasked with, okay, all of the literature about what's going on with these herbicide resistant weeds. Tell us how long you think it's going to take before the weeds get to your specific local area. And so we gave them time to work on this. And then after 45 minutes or so, had a representative from each group stand up and present. It started with the legacy group. Tell us about what it is that you want your farm to be. And they painted these beautiful images of passing it down to their children and their
their
grandchildren.
children. Yeah.
Yeah, to have this fantastic legacy and very kind of sentimental. It was pretty cool. And then the other group stands up and says, that's not going to happen because the weeds that are resistant to the herbicides, they're going to be here in 2 to 3 years. We've got to do something now. And it was so cool that every one of those workshops that we did ended up ended with an opportunity for the farmers to sign a commitment form to say, I'm going to take these specific actions, where they actually identified specific actions. And every single one of them signed the commitment forms. So what we did was we lowered their defenses. They lowered their defenses. We put them in a situation where they didn't have to be defensive because they're talking to their fellow farmers.
Well, they're talking to their fellow farmers, and I love the way that you set that up with the looking at the legacy. Like, here's my dream, and I think even if you would have switched groups, they would have come up with similar.
Yes.
Right? It wouldn't have mattered who was in which group of 5 as they were going through that. They would have come up with similar things, and what that allowed, from what I'm hearing you say, is that okay, now that I have this vision, that's a desire that I want, as opposed to the expert coming in and telling me all the things that I'm doing wrong or that I need to do and I need to change this stuff. And I'm going, yeah, that's a lot of extra work, or you're telling me I'm not a good farmer, or there's all these things that you could see immediately coming up. But no, this is other farmers. We're talking about legacy, and then other farmers who are going, that's not going to happen because we already know this. So you have really, that was brilliant.
Well, thanks for saying that. The great news is that they changed their behavior because of it. And that was really the point of it. So I think that there is a role. My point in all this, Kurt, is that I think that there's a role for thinking about lowering defenses in your office, among your coworkers, among the leaders of your business, to help them be more receptive. And you're not going to do it by pointing your finger at them and saying, stop being defensive.
Right. Well, here's some interesting piece. So Professor Michael, a bunch of professors. There's
Professor Mike, as we know him.
No, there's Wenzel, Woodhat, McLean, all from Finders University, did some interesting work on this, and they were looking at defensive behaviors, right? And so it's common response to when people feel attacked, like we talked about earlier, that you're going to feel defensive and get in that defensive mode. But identity, right, can help. So if I feel more aligned with you, that you and me are part of the same group, that we become less defensive. So what you just talked about, this idea of, hey, it's not expert versus farmers, it's farmers with farmers. And because we've highlighted that identity within them, this is all the social stuff, I think, that when we think about social identity, like which group do I identify with? And you can magnify that. And so in a work situation, as you're just talking about, how are you getting people to identify as the appropriate thing so that they can break down some of that defensiveness?
Right. And of course, at the same time, we've got this self-identity of striving, and at work, I'm thinking the work identity is I'm on the power train and no one's going to stop me from becoming a CEO.
Is that a song, Power Train? Is that
I think Love Train is
Power Train, Love Train. They're all similar, right?
Yeah, the OJs, by the way, it's a fantastic tune. But so as you know, per Emily's comments, right? The self-identity and social thing, these are deeply intertwined.
Yeah, and I think there's the other aspect of this is within organizations. Is what are you identifying with? Are you identifying with a larger organization?
Yeah.
Are you identifying with your division? Are you identifying with your local team?
Mm-hmm.
And those each have different things. And again, silos happen in organizations. And one of the ways that I know we've both worked on this is breaking down silos, is to get people to think about the larger group, because they don't. We tend to get myopic. We put those blinders on like we're racehorses and we can only see what's right in front of our face, and we just barge through. And if you take those blinders off, if you allow people, and actually not just allow, you prime people on thinking about the larger picture, thinking about what you're doing for the patient or the customer or whoever it is. And as an organization, that defensiveness, and I've seen this in organizations, it doesn't disappear. It's not a Pollyanna silver bullet.
No. But you can reduce it.
But you can reduce it.
Yeah. We've worked on projects like that together, and I know you've done a lot of work on that in the past as well.
Well, and even just some simple things of having people be aware of, as we say, awareness isn't, going to solve anything, but even becoming aware helps in some of this. And we can pause to step back and say, why am I getting defensive about this? What are these? What is actually my fear? Right? Why is this feeling like I'm being threatened in some way? And really just take a step back and say, all right, is that true or not?
Agreed.
How does that work for you, Tim? Anything else do you think we need to cover in this fun, grooving session, conversation weirdness that we do?
I would want to add that the concepts, especially from Emily's research, really provided a valuable framework for me thinking about how to apply behavioral science in the workplace. And, for those of you who are interested in applying these approaches, but might need a little bit of assistance, Kurt and I offer these services.
We do?
We do this kind of work, and we can help you get going.
Gosh. Really?
Yeah.
We do this work. We do this work. And, it's one of those things where we've worked in a variety of different companies and situations. And so, hey, if you're looking to implement some of these concepts related to value calculation, reducing defensiveness, or building better connections within your organizations, we can help. Our experience, it's not just knowing this research, right? It's translating these behavioral science principles, the stuff that Emily's talking about, the other work that we know around this. It's translating that into practical applications. How does that apply? How do we put this into actual change initiatives, training, communication, one-on-one coaching, workshops, whatever that would be, in order to make help you be more creative, more effective in messaging and facilitating that change, or building those stronger teams that you want to do. And we'd be happy to just discuss we won't charge you for that first hour-long discussion. How about that, Tim?
It's free.
It's free, 100% free. Just reach out to us. We would love to talk to you about it. We'll even give you free advice on that first hour. And if it's something of value, then maybe you can think of hiring us.
But for now,
for now,
we hope that you're able to take some of these nuggets of insight from Emily's conversation and use them this week as you go out and find your groove.